Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Becca Choate, and I serve as Associate for Global Advocacy and Education with Global Ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ. Welcome to Wednesdays with the World, a United Church of Christ webinar series. This series highlights the ways in which the quest for justice is intersectional and global, providing opportunities for increased awareness of global concerns and highlighting opportunities for advocacy and action. Today's webinar is called The Politics of Persecution, Middle Eastern Christians in an Age of Empire. I'd now like to introduce Peter McCary, Executive for the Middle East and Europe with Global Ministries, who will introduce our speaker and moderate this conversation. Peter.
Thank you very much, Becca, and good morning to everyone who is joining us today. It is indeed a delight to welcome the Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb today to speak about his newest book, The Politics of Persecution, Middle Eastern Christians in an Age of Empire. It's a privilege for me to introduce Reverend Raheb, who is a longtime friend of the United Church of Christ and Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He is the founder and president of al-Kalima University in Bethlehem, which is part of the Diyar Consortium, and is an author and editor of 40 books, including the one we'll talk about today, in addition to other books such as The Cross in Contexts, Suffering and Redemption in Palestine, Faith in the Face of Empire, The Bible Through Palestinian Eyes, and others. His books and numerous articles have been translated so far into 13 languages. Reverend Raheb has served as the senior pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem from June of 1987 until May of 2017, and as the president of the Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land from 2011 to 2016. The ELCJHL and DR are both partners of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and United Church of Christ through Global Ministries. Dr. Raheb was elected in 2018 to the Palestinian National Council and to the Palestinian Central Council. He has founded several NGOs, including the Christian Academic Forum for Citizenship in the Arab World, which is also known as CAFCAO. He's also a founding board member of the National Library of Palestine and a founding member and author of Kairos Palestine. He's received a number of international awards and prizes from a number of sources, including in 2015, the Olaf Palme Prize and others. And so in addition to his visibility on a number of media outlets such as CNN, ABC, 60 Minutes on CBS, the BBC. He also holds a doctorate in theology from Philipps University in Marburg, Germany, and is married to Najwa Khouri and has two daughters, Dana and Tala. We are again so delighted to have this opportunity to engage with Reverend Raheb. We hope that you've had a chance to read his book and look forward to some lively discussion following his presentation. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Raheb to present his book and to share with us this morning. Welcome, Assis, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Peter, for this introduction and for giving me this opportunity to be with you all. The United Church of Christ is one of our faithful partners that we really are proud to be associated with. Thank you for your faithfulness to the gospel and your support to the Christians in Palestine and throughout the Middle East. I'm also glad to see many friends who are joining us today from several UCC congregations that we are in partnership with, but also people from Bright Stars of Bethlehem. So I guess we are really this is going to be a very excellent evening together. And I look forward for the Q&A time. So So let me then start, and we'll start with 3 comments. As you know, many of you know, the Christians in the Middle East are indigenous. This is where it's all started. Palestine is the cradle of Christianity. I always like to say that the Bible actually did not originate in the Bible Belt, but in Palestine. Thanks God. And so when I talk about the Christians of the Middle East, I'm talking about really the cradle of Christianity. The second comment is that though the title Middle East is in the title, I don't like it. Usually I try to avoid it. And because, you know, Palestine and what is called the Middle East is really part of Southwest Asia and North Africa. And the term Middle East is really a colonial term because, you know, you ask yourself, if you live in the US, it's middle of where and east of what? It's only if you live in Europe that Middle East would apply to you. So this is a European colonial construct. And the third comment, this is really a church history book. And the book tells the story and history of the Christians in the Middle East, meaning in this case, Egypt, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and partly Iraq in the last 2 centuries. Basically from Napoleon's invasion until the so-called Arab Spring. And I would say for anyone who really wants to understand what is happening in our region today, I think this book provides maybe an excellent introduction to understanding the context, but also what brought us to the situation we are in today. So these are just introductory comments. Let me then come to present to you my thesis also in 3 parts. You know, people who know me, they know I love always 3 parts. So all my sermons used to have 3 parts. And so you will see 3 here actually recurring. I'm not sure why it didn't. Okay, so that's the first thesis. Christian persecution is a Western construct today that says more actually about the West than about the Christians of the Middle East. When people in the West talk about Christian persecution, the perception is that Christians in our region are persecuted by Muslims. And what I'm saying here is that this is a perception rather than an actual description. And there is lots of politics that is underlining it, which should not be understated and underestimated. So let's keep this first thesis really in mind. The second thesis is that the politics surrounding the notion of Christian persecution has been leveraged by the West and by the Christian evangelical right, not to advance our own situation, but to advance their own agendas, especially their Islamophobe one. I mean, Christians in the Middle East have been living for 14 centuries with Muslims. That's, I think, a big difference to the West, where Muslims came mainly as guest workers with another cultural and religious background often. It wasn't always easy in these 14 centuries, but it was never impossible, and there was always a sense of belonging. And the third thesis that I talk about in the book is that Western empires were never really interested in our faith, but sought most of the time a pretext to promote their imperial interests. And over again, Middle Eastern Christians were sacrificed on the altar of Western national interests. This is really important to know, and I will show this through 3 examples. So again, 3. The first example is from Lebanon. The year 1860 is a very important year in the history and memory of the Lebanese people. During that time, Lebanon was actually, the society was structured in a kind of a feudal system. So you have those few very rich people who owned land, and you had the poorer people who were actually cultivating the land for those richer people. And in 1860, there was a kind of an uprising of the poorer community, peasants, against their landlords. These were Christians against the Christian landlords, and Druze against their Druze landlord. But during this time, actually, that conflict got also like religious connotations. There were over 20,000 Maronite Christians who were massacred. And it was interesting to see how the Western media portrayed that event. It portrayed basically the Druze community, which is a Muslim community, as animals, beasts, and the Christians as victims. Though actually the British were sending arms to the Druze because they were their allies, and France was sending support to the Maronite community. So basically it was 2 empires who were fighting for the control of the region, but arming 2 different groups in a sectarian way. And so if we look here, this is a quotation from a British newspaper in 1860, which says, "The Christians were being hunted down like wild beasts, their houses fired, their men slain, their women violated. Even from the mosques and minarets, the shout for blood arose, and mingled with the muezzin call to prayer might be heard a cry informing the faithful that by an imperial firman declaration, the Christians were devoted to destruction, and their wives and properties had become a lawful prey." So here actually you can see very clearly the Western, in this case British, portray of the conflict. You can very clearly see the Islamophobic language in this case. And it's interesting, they don't mention that it was the British, I mean, their government of this newspaper who gave actually the arms to the Druze to be able to do this. Now, this was a Western perception. Now, let's look how the Christians in the region actually portrayed this event, 1860. And here I would like to mention Butros al-Bustani. Butros al-Bustani was one of the first Protestant converts in the region. He was a scholar, and actually he was supposed to be the first Protestant minister in the region, but he refused the call because he felt that the missionaries, the American missionaries of that time, had more privileges than those that they wanted to grant to him. He was a very interesting person that actually Protestants are very proud of his legacy. He was the one to translate the Bible into Arabic, together with one of the American missionaries, Van Dyke. And he worked at the American consulate in Beirut. So he had access to the Western perception, actually, of this conflict. But he himself described the conflict actually as a civil war rather than a massacre, which is very interesting, because civil war is more a neutral term. He doesn't blame one group against the other, but and here you can see it in this one quotation, he wrote that year, 1860, to both Druze and Christians. He came from the mountain where the massacre took place. I mean, he was indigenous to that area, but he looked at it in a very different way. So he wrote, "You, Christians and Muslims, Druze and Maronites, you drink the same water, you breathe the same air. The language you speak is the same, and so are the ground you tread, your welfare and your customs. You may still be intoxicated from drinking your compatriots' blood or disoriented by the calamities you have suffered. But very soon you must wake up from this stupor and realize the meaning of my advice and where your welfare lies." Boutros el-Bustani, his response to this civil war was actually publishing, like leaflets. He called this leaflet the Clarion of Syria. If you read those, papers, you will feel actually this is a Christian language. He cites the Bible all the time, but he cites also the Quran, and he refers also to the Arabic tradition. So for him, it was clear that Christians and Muslims share actually the same culture and the same language and the same traditions and the same land. But if you want, somehow they were intoxicated by maybe some religious fanaticism, but also intoxicated by the imperial, interests that actually was instrumentalizing and utilizing them. So this is the first example that shows actually how the Western looked at this case, 1860, as a clear case of persecution, while Boutros el-Bustani, a Christian himself from that community where 20,000 people actually were murdered, he looked at it as a civil war between the same people. The second example, actually, we go to Armenia, the Armenian genocide. Between 1880 and 1917, over 1.5 million Armenians and Assyrians were killed, murdered by Turkish nationalists. Again, if we look at the context at that time, we have to realize that Armenian identity has both components. It's a religious and a national identity in one. If you are Armenian, then this is your, religious identification, but this is also your national identification. In 1908, a new Turkish party came to power. They are the Young Turks. They were actually at the beginning a national group. They wanted to leave the religious concept of the empire, and started really calling for nationalism where Christians and Muslims could be together. But then after a few years, and for many reasons, they blended their nationalism, their Ottoman Turkish nationalism, with religious connotation and specifically Islam. And this actually collided with the Armenian identity, especially after Russia. In fact, it's interesting what Russia is doing today in the Ukraine. It was exactly the same thing that did it during this year with Armenia. They tried actually to occupy certain parts of Armenia and to have it as part of Russia, under the pretext that these are Christians. And so they have to be with Russia. And this actually led to the genocide. Now, this was a clear case of persecution. In my book, I gave several examples. Most of them, they are not a clear case of persecution, but this one, the Ottoman genocide, it was. And yet, and here it becomes interesting. During that era, the Germans were actually the allies of the Ottoman Empire. They were together against Britain, France, etc. And the Germans were very well aware of the genocide, but they were ordered, actually, clearly ordered, not to interfere so as not to affect the Ottoman-German alliance in the First World War. Now, this is interesting and strange because, the German Emperor, William II, was not only a pious Christian who saw himself as an emperor entrusted with the Holy Roman Empire, but as the King of Prussia, because he was both the Emperor of Germany and the King of Prussia. As in his capacity as the King of Prussia, he was also the head of the German Protestant Church. So he was basically the primary bishop in Germany. And so you ask yourself, how did the head of the German church side with the Ottoman Turks against fellow Christians, if the Christians are so important for the West? Why did he not only remain silent, but allow genocide of such magnitude to take place? In fact, in the letters, we see that the emperor gave clear instruction to his generals, and here I quote from his writing, not to interfere in Turkey's internal affairs. This prohibition extended to the Armenian question, end of quote. The German ambassador in Istanbul, Baron von Wagenheim, gave an explanation for this German stance. He wrote, Germany must be especially careful not to antagonize the Turkish government. Otherwise, we run the risk of jeopardizing our goals in Turkey, our national interest. When asked to indicate displeasure to the Turks over the Armenian genocide, the German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, made it clear, our only aim is to keep Turkey on our side until the end of the war, no matter whether as a result Armenian do perish or not. So here you can see how Christians were sacrificed, and that was one of my theses, on the altar of imperial interest, in this case, actually German interests. I come to the third example. Following the First World War, the two empires, Britain and France, dismantled the Ottoman Empire and divided the region between them, creating a mandate constructs to suit the interest of the superpower in a sectarian fashion. This is really important. Here you can see how actually it was the empires who actually brought in and supported sectarianism in our region. So Lebanon as a country was crafted as a country with Maronite majority. Syria was divided by the French, and remember the French were promoting laïcité, right? But those same French who promoted laïcité in France divided Syria into 4 sectarian provinces, 2 for the Sunnis, 1 for the Alawites, and 1 for the Druze. In the same manner, Britain actually declared Palestine to be a Jewish homeland. Again, you can see, the sectarian language that was brought into our region after First World War. They even wanted to divide Egypt according to sectarian identities, which did not work. And in this context, actually, for the first time at the United Nations, it wasn't called yet the United Nations, but the League of Nations, for the first time in the early 20s, they invented actually the idea of countries with minorities and majorities. The concept of minority was really not there before the 1920s. And it was, they brought this idea of minority to give the empires a reason actually to interfere into the internal issues of our region. And so minoritization and persecution became 2 sides of the same medal, which basically led to the creation of Israel. That was, sorry, sometimes some pictures, they take some time. So Balfour Declaration, 1917, promising Palestine as a homeland for the Jews, again, the sectarian language, though the Jewish population made less than 5% of the population. And you can really see this sectarian politics of Britain in Palestine very clearly. For example, when you come now to Jerusalem, you will hear even from guides that the old city of Jerusalem is divided into 4 quarters: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Armenian. This is not true. This is a British, actually, concept that was developed in the 19th century. The old city of Jerusalem was mixed, so there were Christians living in the Jewish quarter and Christians living in the Muslim quarter, and vice versa. This should be 1928. In 1928, not 1828. In 1928, the British decided to divide the municipality of Jerusalem into 2, a Jewish and an Arab, against the sectarian policy. In 1947, there was actually in Jerusalem one hospital for leprosy. And in that hospital were Christian, Jews, and Muslims, all lepers. The British came and said it's not good for the lepers with different religions to be together. So they divided they sent the Arab lepers to Silwan in East Jerusalem, and they sent the Jewish lepers to West Jerusalem. So you can see this actually sectarian identity that Britain was promoted, which we are still suffering under today. So Britain, and this, I mean, Balfour was himself actually a Christian Zionist, but he was not interested actually at all in the plight of the Christians in Palestine, but his concentration was on the Jewish population. Though he himself, few years earlier, when he was Prime Minister of Britain, he didn't allow Jews from Russia to enter Britain. And so he wanted really to send them to Palestine, not because he loves them, but because he didn't want them in Britain. And so while the two empires were actually trying to encourage sectarianism in the region, Arab Christians were fighting sectarianism and Western hegemony at the same time by advocating for a united Syria based on a kind of Arab socialism. In Palestine, Christian intellectuals were fighting against the same Western hegemony represented by Zionism. Here I give just two examples, Michel Aflaq and Anton Saadeh, who were promoting this kind of unity against sectarianism. But I will skip this as not to be too late for you. I will skip also this one because I think this is now, the last part is really important. And yet, it was the evangelicals in the US who created the concept of Christian persecution as a central theme in their teaching and promoted it in Congress with some success. Why? Until 1991, the Soviet Union was the focal point for the evangelical movements. Evangelicals were busy smuggling Bibles into the atheist and communist Russia, where the church had to exist underground, and new believers were persecuted. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union caused a tectonic shift and forced evangelicals to rethink their focus and strategy. After the fall of the Iron Wall, evangelical Christians, I think, were afraid they will become unemployed, jobless. So they had to find a new job for them. And so this shift in focus was articulated at the Second International Conference on World Evangelization, known also as Lausanne II, held in Manila in 1989. Louis Bush, an Argentinian-born Christian, urged the 4,300 evangelical leaders from 173 countries to focus their energy in the future on what he called the resistant belt, encompassing Saharan and North Africa, the Middle East, all the way to India and China. And this is the region where 90% of the Muslim population lives. This is actually when we started hearing more and more about Christian persecution. For the last 3 decades, evangelicals have driven the agenda of Christian persecution. With the help of their Republican representatives, they had dedicated US legislation that favors their version of international human rights with a narrow focus on Christian persecution. The election of President Trump and his evangelical Vice President Pence in 2016 brought the issue of Christian persecution back into focus. You know, the well-known Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, he wrote once a poem called They Love Me Dead, about how Arab countries, they love to see Palestinians as martyrs. But I guess also evangelical Christians, they love to see Arab Christians dead because that actually advanced their agenda back home It sells well with their base of Christian right, and it serves them as a proven tool for fundraising. I mean, the status of Christians in the Middle East really depends on a series of socio-political and economical challenges. There is no future for the Christians if there is no change in the whole system. A system marked by absence of modernity, political and economic instability, colonial history, population explosion, high unemployment, mismanagement, weakened human security, outdated educational structure, weak legal system, and climate change. The combination of these problems resulted in de-development. Under such conditions, the survival of the Christian community will continue to be a challenge. And let me end with this last one. Many Middle Eastern Christians throughout history have understood that they have no other option but to get involved in the national and regional struggle towards social and political transformation. The history of Middle Eastern Christians is therefore not so much one of persecution, but one of resilience. This is my main thesis, basically, and this should be acknowledged. Over a period of 2 millennia, Middle Eastern Christianity survived one empire after the other by developing great elasticity in adjusting to changing context. Christians learned how to survive atrocities and how to resist creatively while maintaining a dynamic identity. It is obvious today that the visibility and vitality of Middle Eastern Christianities are no longer what they once were. Numbers have been dwindled to a historic low of 3%. Nevertheless, this has not deterred Christians from contributing to their communities and advocating for neighborly relations, equal citizenship, and open, tolerant, and pluralistic society. It is true that immigration continues to exact a toll on Middle Eastern Christianity, yet even when Middle Eastern Christians were displaced or migrated, they succeeded in developing diasporic and hybrid identity. And I think Peter Macari is just one example of this diasporic and hybrid identity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aziz Mitri. Your presentation today and the book that you have published, and indeed much of your work, has focused on the reality of Middle Eastern Christians. And today you have helped us to understand their fragility, but not in an alarmist way. And so by focusing on the long history, the broad view, the broad perspective of history, you've helped us to understand the narrative that we hear in this country regularly, why it has come about, but also to think differently about the presence of Middle Eastern Christians. And we are grateful for your perspective and for your witness in the region. We want to offer an opportunity for our audience to ask questions, and I see that there are already a couple in the question and answer box, so please submit them there. But if I could just follow up briefly on a few things before we move to those. Your work has focused on the resilience, has focused on the engagement of Middle Eastern Christians in the region. You, through the Religion and State program in Diyar, have focused on a civil state and the rights and dignity of all people through law and other institutions. You've been engaged recently in an initiative to promote a document called The Choice for Abundant Life. We Choose Abundant Life, which is an effort of Middle Eastern Christians from Palestine, Lebanon, and from throughout the region to promote a different narrative and also a different future for the region. Would you be willing to share with us a little bit about that document, We Choose Abundant Life, how it came about and what it calls for? You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Actually, this document fits very well in the book, because we speak against the idea of minority, and also against the idea that the Western is the one supporting the Christians. So in that sense, actually, it fits very well. But the important thing of this document is actually, this is the first Middle Eastern document that is contextual in nature, and that it chooses geopolitics as one of its hermeneutical keys to understanding the current context and the role of Christianity. I don't have enough time to talk about it, but you can check it up. We choose abundantlife.org. There you can see the document, but also some videos that explain what we stand for. Basically for a society that is marked by pluralism, rather by uniformity, and for calling for really a civil state which is again against this sectarian identities that are flourishing so much in our region right now.
Thank you. It would be, we would be remiss if we didn't offer you an opportunity to share something about your work with Dar al-Kalima University. You have described it and the institutions that are associated with the Diyar Consortium as facts on the ground, a reality that cannot be erased, and a witness and presence for the Palestinian Christian community in Bethlehem. And so could you share something about Dar al-Kalima, and especially as it has been recently fully accredited as a university able to grant the whole range of degrees?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, Dar al-Kalima University actually in Bethlehem is the first and only university in Palestine that focuses on arts and culture as the tool for social transformation. And for me, Dar al-Kalima is really, if you look at our story and history, and actually you can read this history. It's only 25 years when we started, 25 years ago we started. And it is close to a miracle that we have today university. And for me, this is actually the best sign for this resilience I was talking about. You know, that we as Christians, you know, we don't want to feel that we are a persecuted minority, but we are actors in our societies. And so we can be part of those who make and shake our society. And our mission is really to train the next generation of creative leaders in Palestine and to empower them to tell their story in the way they would like to tell us, and not in the way we are always forced to tell it. And so, yeah, you can visit our website, daralkalima.edu.ps. You can see there, I wrote the history of 25 years, and it really speaks about resilience and social entrepreneurships. And this is actually what I see the role of Christians in this region.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions that are coming in from the audience, so I want to turn to those. The first one comes from a pastor of a congregation with a significant amount of people of Assyrian heritage. Could you speak about the current state of the Assyrian Christian community?
Yeah, you know, I have actually a chapter on that history. I hope that the pastor can see it, because especially in the 30s, you know, the Assyrians again, they wanted actually to have their own state, because, you know, with the sectarianism, they said, you know, if you give the Jews a Jewish state, why not give the Assyrians, with our heritage and history, state in the Nineveh Valley. The British actually, they disappointed them, and they favored a Sunni country with an Assyrian majority. That led actually to displacement, and many of the Assyrian community actually left, and today they are the largest community is in fact in the US, in the Chicago area, is their patriarch residing. Again, this is one of the sad stories where we can see how the British actually, they sacrificed the Assyrian community on the altar of their political interests.
There are a couple of questions about dialogue and engagement with other communities. Can you share maybe some examples of Christian and Muslim organizations working together for peace? And also, do you engage with Arab Jewish members of the community in the theme of working together?
Yeah, I mean, regarding Christian Muslim organization, I skipped this one slide. But I have a chapter on that. It's really interesting. If we look, when did formal Christian-Muslim dialogue starts in our region? Because it used to be a dialogue of life, and that was enough. But the formal dialogue started in the late 70s, beginning 80s. Why? Because during this time, in 1973, we had the petrodollar. That was the first time when the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, used petroleum as a weapon, if you want, so the prices were going up rapidly. This had Saudi Arabia and Iran with their reservoir, left them with lots of cash. So they started to export their version of Islam into the region. And this actually created many conservative forms of Islam that suddenly were supported financially to a great extent. The Arab Christians, in response to this phenomena, they started creating dialogue centers. So if we look in South Lebanon and in Palestine, in Bethlehem, al-Liqa Center, for example, was established in 1982. In Lebanon, certain time, almost the same time, and dialogue centers started to mushrooming after that time. Now, do we have, I'm not sure if the question was about if we have connection to Christians inside Israel. The majority are Palestinian Christians there. And yes, I mean, we have lots of connection because we belong to the same community.
Thank you. Perhaps the question was referring to connections you might have with members of the Jewish community who come from Arab countries originally, Yemeni Jews or Moroccan Jews who now live in the area Israel-Palestine today.
Some, but very few.
Thank you. There are a few questions about the situation in Israel-Palestine, as you might imagine. One relates to the status of Christians in the apartheid systems that are in place in Israel. And perhaps that's linked to a question that another colleague is asking, who would be curious to know what you would want to say to American Jewish rabbis and American Jews about how they could understand the situation of Christians in Palestine today.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of apartheid is a very important issue. There were recently, in the last 6 months, 3 very important human rights reports published. The first was by B'Tselem, which is a Jewish Israeli human rights organization. that they basically wrote that on both sides of the Green Line, there is already an apartheid system. And then Human Rights Watch, they came with the same assessment that the threshold to apartheid is already crossed. And just recently, a month ago, actually, Amnesty International brought out their report that state almost the same thing, but with lots of details. And I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to read this Amnesty International report on apartheid. Now, again, interesting. I mean, Christians in Palestine are suffering under the Israeli apartheid. And yet, the US government, European governments, they are refusing even to accept this report by human rights organizations and refusing to do anything about it. And again, this shows that really nobody in governments really is interested in the plight of Christians, but they want to use us when it suits their own interests.
Mm-hmm. That's perhaps a good lead-in to a question about the importance of churches around the world speaking up about the situation of Palestinians and Palestinian Christians in general, in specific. As you're aware, the United Church of Christ adopted a resolution at its General Assembly last summer, a declaration for a just peace between Palestine and Israel, which named apartheid and named the oppression of Palestinian people as sin, and was critical of Christian Zionism, something you mentioned in your presentation. Similarly, just today, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ leadership, the general minister and president and two unit presidents, issued a pastoral letter called Compelled to Witness, which also is an opportunity for the disciples leadership to speak up on these issues related to apartheid and the sin of the oppression of Palestinian people, Christian Zionism, and other things. Would you comment on the importance of churches around the world speaking up about the reality as we hear it from partners in the region?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I would like to take this opportunity actually to thank the leadership of the UCC for the letter that came out today.
The disciples letter, yes.
The UCC and disciples letter. And since we have also Reverend John Dorhauer with us, I would like also to extend my thanks to him. And you mentioned the resolution that you passed last summer. This is before B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty talked about it. And so for me, you are a prophetic church. And it is really important when human rights organizations speaks up, churches cannot be silent. Unfortunately, there are several churches around the world who remain silent because they don't want to pay the price for speaking truth to power. But the UCC and disciples are doing that. And for me and for us in Palestine and throughout the region, you are really a sign of hope that we are not abandoned. This is really what is needed more and more. And we need to keep pushing churches to speak out, because often, you know, they want a kind of cheap tranquility so that they really do not bother with the difficult issues.
Thank you, Assis. We have a number of questions and very little time left. So I'm going to have to pick maybe one or two that we have time left for, and then we'll need to move toward a close for this session. But if I could do that, first, could you speak about the participation of Palestinian Christians in the revitalization of Palestinian unity across the geographical divides that have been created by Israel and imposed by Israel.
Yeah, I mean, Palestinian Christians play a major role in the Palestinian society in general. In fact, last year we published a study that you can download from our website of the university. We looked at the 296 church-related organizations in Palestine, just to see the witness and the diaconia and the role and the work they are doing. And it's amazing. I mean, the church-related organization are the third largest employer in Palestine. After the government comes number one, the UNRWA is number two, and church-related organizations employ around 10,000 people in their different work, and they serve 1.5 million people a year in average. Though the Palestinian Christians in total are less in the West Bank and Gaza are less than 50,000, and inside Israel around 120,000 Palestinian Christians. The majority of Palestinian Christians today, they live in the diaspora. They are maybe over 700,000 Christians.
Thank you. We really are close to the end of the time that we have today, and I want to respect your time and that of our audience. We have a number of questions that are unanswered, and if you're willing, we'll capture those and ask if you would be willing to offer brief responses in written form to those. But we want to thank you for your deep engagement today with us and for your long commitment to the Christian presence in the Middle East, and especially of Palestinian Christians, and your commitment to helping the world understand the reality today, as well as the historical trajectory that has led us to where we are. We're grateful to you. We're grateful to the partnership that we share with you. And we look forward to continuing to work to strengthen that and to amplifying the voice that you so articulately bring to this conversation. Thank you, Assis Mitri, and thank you to our audience today as well.
And thank you, Pekka.
Thank you both, Peter and Reverend Dr. Raheb. We appreciate you joining us today. I want to invite all of you who are currently watching to join us to our next in this Wednesdays with the World series, our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, March 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and it is on, we'll be celebrating 100 years with Back Bay Mission, a historic UCC organization on the coast of Mississippi. So keep an eye out on your emails for that registration information, and I hope that you will join us then. You can also follow all of our work that Global Ministries does at globalministries.org. Make sure you get our weekly updates. You can get all kinds of information on our partnerships with folks around the world. So thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you a pleasant rest of your day.
Siblings in Christ, if this conversation has moved you, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help programs like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed as you continue your day. Know that you are not alone, and we are holding you in prayer. Amen.